Good evening. I'm Patrick Murphy-Racey, and I'm from the United States of America, but I bet you already figured that out. I wanted to give you a heads up that this is a recorded message. Because the wonky nature of the internet sometimes, it was thought to be safer to record my part of the presentation. My other companions, the ambassadors, are over there in Europe with you. I think they're going to do theirs live, but mine, it was just thought to be better, more seamless if I did it this way. So I wanted to encourage you to take notes because at the very end of the evening, all three of us are going to be answering your questions if you have any. So be sure to use the chat box or to ask questions at the end. So just make some notes if you want to during the video. Because the worst thing is that you'd walk away with a question unanswered, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. So here we go. I'm a huge fan of the Nordic countries, and I always treasure the time I get to spend there. I've spent most of the time in Norway and Sweden, but I've also been to Denmark as well, but I haven't made it to Finland yet. I'd like to. My background is in photojournalism. I have a degree in photojournalism from a university here in the U.S. I basically spent a bit of time in newspapers and then transitioned into magazines, where I became primarily an editorial freelance photographer. And then I moved into more corporate work, industrial photography, and in doing annual reports for businesses, big, publicly held companies. I also have delved into higher education photography, which is one of my favorite things to do because they let me do everything. I get to shoot sports, portraits, video. Why should you listen to me about anything? First, I would say that I've been doing photography full-time for my entire career of 35 years. In that time, I've shot Canon FD, then I went to Nikon manual focus, then I went to Canon EOS, I think in 1992, and then all the way until I was 19 years a Canon shooter, and then I went back to Nikon autofocus gear in 2011, and then ended up working with that gear until I started shooting the A6000, which initially I started shooting everything from the wide to 7200 range with that, and then I was still shooting Nikon. Then I was adapting lenses to work with Sony, and then eventually ended up with the Sony full frame, which was amazing, and that then had to exercise a lot of patience while they learned how to make glass, which they do very well. It wasn't until they made a 400-2.8 that I became fully Sony all the way. So I'm very happy to be no longer using adapted lenses. I'm just so happy with, well, obviously the Alpha 1, but the lenses that go on the Alpha 1 are tremendous assets to everything I do. I've broken down my sort of assessment of the Alpha 1 into different areas that I think go together. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the image quality at 50 megapixel. I'm going to address that first, and then we'll address each other section as they come. So number one is the 50 megapixel sensor. It's important to understand that this sensor is not from another camera. It's not borrowed from video. It's not from the Venice. This sensor is brand new and designed only and exclusively for the Alpha 1 body. This is important because they designed this sensor basically to do everything, but it's a big sensor. 50 megapixel is a huge sensor. And before I had the opportunity to shoot the Alpha 1 for the very first time, I told everybody that would listen to me that going larger than 36 megapixel is silly for a sports camera. It just doesn't, we don't need it. Then I shot the Alpha 1 and realized how much the punch-in changed, where I could zoom in the sensor in the camera, and it's like having a built-in teleconverter that doesn't cost you a stop of light. Once I realized how good the images were when you were zoomed in on the sensor and getting 21 megapixels out of what was zoomed in, I became a quick convert to 50 megapixels, let me tell you. Yeah, I'm all over it. And the ability to crop, you can do severe crops to these images and they still work great. Unfortunately, Sony could only send me one Alpha 1 to test with, and so I didn't have a down court camera. So I was using a 24 to 105 on the close end of the court. And of course, when the action goes down the other end, I didn't have a 300 and another body to stick it on. So I just stayed with a 105. Now, if you punch in 1.5x with the 105, you get a 157.5 millimeter lens. And this is what it looks like all the way down at the other end. And this is what it looks like cropped. Unbelievable. If you could ever told me that I would have been able to shoot down court with a 150 millimeter lens and actually make a picture that was meaningful and able to be sent to somebody, I'd be shocked. Then on top of that, you have the fact that this is a great camera in low light. So it's a big file, a huge file, and it's an excellent camera in low light. And Sony's saying 15 plus stops of dynamic range, which is incredible. And I found that to be true. Shooting tennis indoors under really bad, poor lighting, I was able to get very, very good results. I would say that the Alpha 1 rivals the low light performance of even the A7S II and even the A7S III. It's certainly on par with A9 II, with the added advantage of the bigger file and even better skin tone renderings in low light. A lot of cameras will give you high ISOs and even low noise, but they won't make faces look right or skin tone. And because of the cinema influence that Sony has, I think that the Venice is coming through in the Alpha 1 quite well. I'm going to add some comments here that are going to sound like I'm going to be getting into someone else's territory in this evening's presentation, but I want to talk about S-Cinetone. So the Alpha 1 is the very first action-oriented camera, like the A9 or A9 II, that has logs. And so logs is typically a video setting. Most still photographers don't know about logs or why you'd even want to fool with them. But the logs in the camera allow you to get something called S-Cinetone. And this is literally from the Venice movie camera. I use the S-Cinetone log in my still photography all the time. That might surprise some of you, but the ability for the camera to render skin tones accurately, give you lots of mid-range in midtones, and have recoverable highlights. These are all very important things if you're shooting sports at noon in a bright, bright, sunny summer day. So the ability for the Alpha 1 sensor to wrap itself around with massive dynamic range and then adding into that S-Cinetone is a huge advantage that I have. The other thing that's really nice is I can gang tone. I can tone like everything in a take at once in Capture One or Lightroom, whatever. And this is a great advantage for me. And so I can take a really harsh, nasty, contrasty light and I can shoot everything as normal, but adding S-Cinetone over my images while I'm shooting them. And I can get really, really great results with that. So I really appreciate the fact that logs are in the super camera in addition to the big file and all the rest. So that's really great. Now this is not a great couple of pictures, but first base play, it's easy to get the ball in front of the mitt. If you're paying attention and you're like on the action, you're going to get this. What is unusual is to get this next frame where the ball is inside the mitt, but the mitt is not closed yet. And this is the great gift of 30 frames per second. In baseball, it's going to be a wonder. The big news about the Alpha 1 when it first came out was 30 frames per second, and it is great. It's awesome to be able to shoot 30 frames a second, especially blackout free. But I think there are other things that are more important about the camera. Now, as an example, like it's 1.5 times the frame rate of the A9 II and the A9, which, 20 frames a second was amazing anyway, especially blackout free. But it's kind of funny that the high plus setting on the Alpha 1 is 30 frames, and now just the old normal high is 20 frames a second, the same as the A9 II and the A9. And honestly, I shot 30 frames a second on everything I did when I got to test the camera, but 30 frames a second is too fast for many sports. Now, certain sports it's going to be awesome for. Anything that requires people running at full tilt, like in track and field, I think it's going to be a tremendous asset. In American football, certainly, running backs are very quick, agile, and fast. And to be able to shoot them every time they push off with their foot, I'm actually getting 2 frames of them in the air, not touching the ground, which is huge. I got that with A9 II. I think it's going to be possible to get 3 frames of them in the air, which is just a huge benefit. I'll take it. I'll take it. So even though 30 frames a second is a little too fast for a lot of sports, there are moments when 30 frames is awesome and it's perfect. The next section I want to talk about is the huge advantages in increased performance, accuracy, and speed of the autofocus of the Alpha 1 over the A9 II and the A9. Now, before I get into that, I want to state that the A9 and the A9 II are fantastic cameras, and they autofocus unbelievably well. They're so good at what they do. However, A1 brings a whole new level of performance and accuracy to still photography and video as well. A9 and A9 II have what are called 60 time per second autofocus and auto exposure adjustments. This means that when you're shooting 20 frames per second on the A9 II, for instance, the camera has enough time at that speed, at 20 frames per second, to make 3 different separate adjustments of autofocus and exposure for each frame before it commits to a focus setting. Alpha 1 is able to achieve 120 adjustments to each individual file at 30 frames per second. So the camera is not only faster by 10 frames per second than the A9 II, but it's also faster and more accurate at autofocus once it's shooting at 30 frames per second. It's a phenomenal performance. It's really an unparalleled experience when you're editing the pictures, especially because there's just nothing out of focus virtually. There are 693 autofocus points in the A9 II. There are 759 in the Alpha 1. So they've made it, it's basically full frame. I mean, the entire 2:3 proportion is covered left, right, up, and down with autofocus points. And this is a combination of contrast and phase detection points together, combining. So it gives you this sort of unstoppable ability to achieve autofocus in things that are just so fast. It's hard to describe, honestly. Even when you go into APS-C mode, you still retain all 759 autofocus points. I'm not exactly sure how Sony managed that, but it's pretty slick. Perhaps the lead that was lost in the announcement of the Alpha 1 was the flicker-free aspect in shooting 30 frames per second on silent shutter. In prior cameras, all of them, in order to get flicker-free performance out of it, you had to stop shooting electronic shutter and leave silent shutter, go into mechanical shutter, which then put you at 10 frames per second. And then if you read the directions in the manual really carefully, you'll find out that what was happening is the mechanical shutter was advancing or retarding a little bit before it shot frames, so that you weren't able even to get the full 10 frames per second. It was slowing it down because some frames needed to be faster, some slower, depending on what the light was doing in terms of the pulsing from the artificial lights. The Alpha 1 has been completely set free from mechanical shutter for the purpose of anti-flicker. And so now, instead of being relegated to 10 frames per second and using anti-flicker, we can now shoot at 30 frames per second with a silent shutter and blackout free and experience no results of anti-flicker. So it is an unbelievable experience shooting in poor light, in very, very poorly lit indoor situations or under lights at night. And to be able to shoot 30 frames a second all of a sudden was just awesome for me. I mean, it was really... And in the tennis photography that I did, you'll see this flicker sign shows up. What you're able to do in the menus is turn anti-flicker on, and just leave it on. And anytime the camera enters into a situation where it senses that the lights are pulsing, it will automatically then engage anti-flicker, so you don't even have to fool with it. It's a very, very cool system, and it just makes it easier on everybody. Now, like probably many of you, I have been using A9 and A9 II for a long time, but I love the files I get from the A7R IV. The only problem is the A7R IV does not focus as well as the A9 or the A9 II, and it certainly is not in the same league with the A1. So, but I get frustrated sometimes because I'll get a really great frame that might be a little soft with A7R IV. And the great thing about Alpha 1 is that now we have one camera that does everything really, really well. In fact, maybe the best. And so here's an image that was shot where the strobes didn't fire, and still the camera was able to focus on a completely backlit model. There's like 3 windows open and a lamp in the background. There's no light in front of her whatsoever. So she's looking at me in total darkness. And even though that's the case, the camera never missed a beat and focused no matter what. Here's the results of that image. And here's another image that was a closer shot with a 135 1.8 G Master lens, one of my favorites. And as you zoom in even further, you realize that, you know, if you get the Alpha 1, you may need to be doing a lot more post retouching than ever before, because not only do you have pimples to get rid of, you have like blood vessels in the eyes, and you have split ends in the hair and dandruff and everything else. So be careful what you ask for, because Alpha 1 delivers whether you need to do that post or not. Alpha 1 employs a 9.44 million dot EVF now. So the quality is the same as the A7S III, except for a huge difference, and that is it's going twice as fast. So the frame rate that the EVF, that is what to say, when you're looking through the camera, you can actually go all the way up to 240 frames per second now. So there are now 3 choices of speed of the EVF. If you want the highest quality possible, you can just choose 60 frames per second, and you're going to get that full 9.44 mil dot experience, which is nearly, some people are saying, and I kind of agree with them, that I prefer the EVF in the Alpha 1 over an optical viewfinder. I really do. I like it much better. But if you want to go a little faster than that, you can match the speed of the A9 and the A9 II by choosing 120 frames per second. But if you want to go all the way up, if you're shooting maybe F1 really tight, or you're doing pans, MotoGP or something like that, something that's extremely fast, if you're really close, shooting on the outside of a turn in speed skating, for instance, some of the Olympic sports, it will really be beneficial to have 240 frames a second. Be aware, though, that when you choose 240 frames a second, 2 things are going to happen. One, your quality is going to automatically drop in the viewfinder. And then 2, your battery life is going to be impacted by this. Not terribly so, but you're going to notice a difference. It's going to kind of drain down. So my advice to you is, if you shoot a lot of sports, I would leave it at the 120 frame per second setting unless you really, really need 240. If you need 240, it's there and you can use it. But I like the quality, and I think the speed is pretty good. It's good enough for most sports to be at the medium setting, but it's so cool that I can turn all the way up if I want to or need to. If you haven't figured it out, I wear glasses, and many of us do, and it's very frustrating. I've never had the ability to look into a camera that Sony has made where I can see the entire inside of the viewfinder easily. There's now what's called eye relief, or what Nikon used to call high eye point viewfinder. Basically what they've done is they've made it where you can push the EVF back a little bit. So you have 2 choices now of either 41 degrees field of view or 33 degrees field of view. And this is phenomenal because it allows those of us that wear glasses to see everything in the viewfinder for the first time. This is a huge benefit to those of us that shoot sports. Sometimes I will use the diopter and take my glasses off and leave that big magnification in there. But there are other times in other sports where I'll wear my glasses and then push back a little bit where I can see the entire inside of the viewfinder. So either way, it's just great to have the option. It's a wonderful asset now for those of us that wear glasses. One of the fixes that's happened on the Alpha 1 that Sony's not really talked about is they've moved the eye sensor in the viewfinder in the EVF to the bottom center. Now, in its new position, it's easy to keep clean, and most importantly, you can't bump the eyepiece so that it blocks the sensor and shuts the camera down where you can't use it all of a sudden. So this is a great benefit. I'm really, really happy they did this, and it's another example of Sony's attention to detail and how they listen to photographers that are actually out in the trenches doing this every day. And the feedback that we're giving them is actually making new product. It's so cool. The next thing I want to talk about is the processing power of Alpha 1. Now this sounds crazy, but there's 8 times more processing power in an Alpha 1 than an A9 II. Now the reason why this is so amazing is the A9 II is so fast and so powerful on its own. But with 8 times the speed of processing, this allows the camera to chunk through 50 megapixel files at the rate of 30 frames per second, even shooting RAW. So it's really an amazing feat of engineering that they were able to achieve this. So now with the new Alpha 1 processor, it requires the sort of throughput of the camera, or the fire hose, if you will, to be much larger to allow tons more information to travel inside the camera from the sensor and then finally into the card, which has also changed. Believe me when I tell you, I know a lot of people have been emailing me and finding my YouTube channel asking me, hey, can I use my Sony G cards with this camera? And then the answer is, yeah, you can, but why would you want to? Why would you want to go that slow? So remember, G cards have 295/300 megabits per second up and down. The new CF Express Type A cards that Sony has are 700 and 800 megabits per second. So they're so much faster than you're used to. They're more than double the speed. Basically, you're not going to want to use SD cards for the Alpha 1. You're really going to want to go ahead and just commit to the CF Type A cards because it's the only way to realize the speed and power of Alpha 1. Alpha 1 has a brand new mechanical shutter. Now, the shutter itself is a combination of old technology and brand new technology that Sony has invented, which is really cool. These motors are taking a mechanical piece of carbon fiber and they're moving them extremely fast, slowing them down, and that this combination of these two shutter, this first curtain and the second shutter, opening at a much faster rate than has ever been before possible, is allowing the camera to shoot strobes at 1/400th of a second, and that is phenomenal. Phenomenal. This has opened up new vistas for those of us that use strobes to shoot in arena sports like the NBA and the NHL. So hockey and basketball here. It is a massive change, and it's a welcome change because it means that if we have a small set of strobes, maybe Elinchrom, which are made in Europe, that's what I use, you can go into a big arena that's very bright with a set of small Elinchrom monoblock strobes, and you can illuminate that entire arena, and because of the high sync speed of 400th of a second, it means that I'm able to do away with all the ambient light in there and then freeze the action much better than I would without that high sync speed. Prior to this, I did figure out how to hypersync the A9 II to 3/20th of a second, but it's not a clean 320. You could go to 250 with perfectly clean, but this ability to use just shove a pocket wizard on the top of the camera and absolutely get to shoot 400th of a second clean is amazing. And remember, you can, if you're in APS-C mode, you can actually shoot at 500th of a second, which matches the contour shutter of the leaf shutter cameras like Hasselblad. So it's a huge change for those of us that still use a lot of strobes, especially in arenas for sports photography. It's a great benefit to us. I'm so thankful to have this 400 strobe sync. One last note that a lot of people again missed in the announcement of the camera is that when you're in electronic shutter, you can now use a strobe. You can sync a strobe in full frame up to 200th of a second, and you can go, if you go to APS-C and you go in that punch-in mode, you can go to 250th of a second. Now this is really cool, and you might think, why would I want to do that? Those of us that shoot a lot of portraits with lights, you can actually see the pop of the light when you're looking through a blackout-free viewfinder. And this is a huge advantage. You can see if somebody blinked, you can see if somebody's got a lazy eye, and there's a lot of half blinks. You can also see when you get a really great expression, you think you may have nailed it. So this combination with IAF and tracking autofocus is a huge asset for us. Every once in a while when you're shooting an arena on strobes, they don't fire. Now, typically when this happens, the image is so underexposed that you just delete it. But when I was shooting the A1 in this exact situation, I actually saw this picture and I kind of zoomed in on it in the camera and I went, wow, that might be savable, which is crazy because it's about 4 stops underexposed, but I kept it. And I was able to make this out of that image. And it's just another testament of how good the sensor is. People for years have been buying cameras based on specifications and features. And really from now on, it's all about the sensor. You got to look at the sensor and what it's able to do. And this is like nothing short of a miracle. To be able to get this image out of a 4-stop underexposed picture is pretty crazy. So in my estimation, the Alpha 1 gives us the best ever autofocus performance speed and accuracy that I've ever seen in any camera, period. I think Sony is so far ahead on this point that it's just not even funny anymore. The competition has so far to go to even reach into the same realm as Alpha 1. Most of them are trying to figure out how to make a camera like an A9 II still, and now we already have the Alpha 1, so it's a really cool thing. The massive files from the Alpha 1 are a joy to edit with. It's really fun to do post-processing on these files because there's so much headroom and dynamic range. They're so beautiful. Even when you crop in, you still have tons of meat left on the bone, shall we say. It is a fantastic experience. But when you're shooting pictures with Alpha 1 and you have the CF Type A cards, it gives you a unhindered, non-weight experience that I've wanted for a long, long time. Before Alpha 1, the DSLRs were still better at being able to shoot a burst of frames and immediately look at them and preview them in the camera. Now with the speed of the processing and the speed of the cards, it can accept those images so fast. We now have that combination giving us the ability to shoot a burst and immediately look at what we just shot, which is really powerful, and it makes the camera a greater tool for deadline photography, especially in the sports world. There's now a new option with the delete button. Now, typically in the past, you had 2 different options in the delete. Now there's 3, and one of them was what I call the double tap. And so now you can literally hit the trash button twice fast, and the picture's gone. So if you what we typically do with Alpha 1, when you have 30 frames a second, it's really hard not to shoot beyond the peak moment of action. So you'll end up with 6-8 frames, and when you're first starting out, honestly, you'll shoot 15 extra past the point of the picture. And so it's really nice to be able to, in between plays on the field, you can just double tap, double tap, double tap until you get back to the image, and then you can stop. So it's helping me to cull images on the field while I'm shooting sports live rather than doing it in a laptop afterwards in a press room or something like that. It's just giving me that much more performance on the post side of things and helping me not waste a lot of time. I was very fortunate in that I got an Alpha 1 in my hands for about 8 days. And I shot a lot of different sports in that 8 days. Every day I had something else planned. Some days I had 2 things. The big letdown was the day I had to send it back because I couldn't keep the camera. A few days later, after spending a little over a week shooting the Alpha 1, I shot an American football game. And I had to go back to using my A9 II. Now, I love the A9 II. But it was a slug. It was so slow I couldn't believe it. And so for those of you that are kind of thinking, yeah, I can justify one of these cameras, but I can't do 2, I think you're going to quickly find a way to get that second body or even the third body. Because when you have this incredibly fast camera that does everything fast and quickly, it's really hard to go back and use something slower once you're accustomed to the Alpha 1. it just kind of ruins you, and in just a few minutes it ruins you. Once you get acclimated to the speed and power of the Alpha 1, you're just going to want to only shoot that. So that was my experience. I will have two of them when my second one eventually comes, but for right now I could only get one. But I'm excited for getting that second body. In closing, I have just a few thoughts about the Alpha 1. Since Sony's very beginning, they have chosen to make full-frame cameras in R for resolution, S for sensitivity, and the A9 cameras were all for action. So you have action, sensitivity, and resolution. The Alpha 1 is clearly a combination of all three of those. It is kind of the perfect melding, if you will, of the three different specialty cameras that Sony has made to date. Alpha 1 just doesn't really have a peer, in my opinion. There's not really anything to compare it to. You'd have to go, the closest thing to the Alpha 1 is the A9 II and the A7R4 and the A7S III and the Venice and the FX9, and you see where I'm going with this. It's just a phenomenal camera. It truly is a super camera. There are cars that have been made, especially in Europe, Ferrari and Porsche and, Lamborghini and, different companies that have made supercars. And this camera, Alpha 1, is truly a super camera. It's just like that, except that it's dependable and predictable and pretty much maintenance free, because most of the time, let's face it, it's going to be using an electronic shutter. There's no moving parts. So it's really in many ways a perfect product. And it's a breathtaking camera. It's a camera that I did not expect. I wasn't expecting an Alpha 1. I was expecting an A9 III with 250 sync, not a 50 megapixel monster camera that would shoot even faster than an A9 II. So anyway, I'm going to stop at this point, and what I need to do next is I need to transition into my favorite lenses, which is going to be a separate video entirely. So let's go and head for lenses.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Thank you so much, Patrick. That was amazing. You should know all the technical aspect of this badass of a camera Alpha 1. Thank you so much. What do you think, Annie?
I'm very fascinated, actually, and I'm very happy that Patrick is thrilled to have tested A1. But actually, I would like to hear more about the lenses, his go-to lenses.
Shouldn't wait anymore. So let's roll it and see what the lenses can do for Patrick and his photography.
All right, welcome to Patrick's favorite lenses. And it should be no surprise to any of you that they're all G Masters. So the 135 1.8 G Master lens is the sharpest lens I have ever used in my entire lifetime. And that includes shooting Leica M in the 80s and the 90s, all the Hasselblad stuff. I shot the GX680 system by Fuji. I've shot everything Nikon and Canon has ever had in recent memory. Nothing comes close to what the 135 1.8 GM does. I use it for sports, portraits, weddings, corporate, nature, and anything else I can think of, because I love to take it with me, take it out of my bag, and just shoot it. It's amazing. I even use it on assignments when I know the client won't use the pictures from it, but I just want to see them afterwards in post. I think the 135 GM is about as close to a flawless lens as is possible to get. It does everything perfectly for me. It's replaced my need for a long zoom. I think I got this lens and I owned it for about 9 months when I realized I hadn't touched my 7200 2.8 in all that time. So I pretty much am happy to give up the versatility of a zoom in order to use this instead all the time. Of course, I retasked the focus hold button on all my lenses to allow me to punch in to the 1.5x zoom on sensor, and that leaves me with a 21 megapixel file with the Alpha 1. So a 135 times 1.5x is a 202 millimeter 1.8 21 megapixel file. That's astounding. This is a picture I shot for a billboard for a small college that was trying to sell football tickets. And as you can see, this is the 135, and I'm in full autofocus. And even though this guy's full frame, this is like literally the width of the frame. It's achieving eye autofocus through the face mask on the helmet. It's just tremendous. So this guy is jumping into high jump pads in the end zone of his football field. And of course, I've got him lit. This is high speed sync. I think it's about 3,000th of a second or something like that to stop him. But you can see how narrow the depth of field is. His fingertips are out of focus. His shoes are way out of focus. It's just his face, and where the ball is, that's the same plane, which is sharp. I love to use the 135 G Master on portraits, family portraits, senior pictures, professional portraits for corporate, whatever. The only complaint I've ever had about it is it might be too sharp, and sometimes you have to kind of dumb it down in post because not everybody wants to see every single imperfection of their face. This is another lit setup. I'm using Elenchromes to freeze the action here, but I use the 135. Now, he is jumping in darkness, total darkness. So it's incredible. I shouldn't say total. There's some window light behind him, but the camera's able to track even in darkness and keep him in focus as he's flying through the air and the strobes trip. Alpha 1 is an amazing, amazing camera for portrait work. It will never let you down in terms of focus. The retouching that is needed now is greater, not because it's a 50 megapixel file, but because it sees split ends and dandruff and literally blood vessels in the eyes. This is shot with a 135-1.8 G Master through the glass. We don't have holes in our hockey arena here, so you kind of have to put up with what you got. And even getting something like this through nasty, dirty glass is pretty impressive. Again, it's what I reach for first for portraits every time. It may be a little short for this purpose, but I tell you, I really like using the 135-1.8 G Master for end zone pictures and maybe on goal at soccer. It's just long enough and fast enough to knock the backgrounds out of focus, even when people are, maybe 30 meters away. It's really, really cool. So I take this lens on assignments that probably most people wouldn't, but I just love to shoot it because it's so sharp. It's fun to look at the pictures. My next one is the 24-1.4 G Master. I love this little lens. It's tiny, it's small, it's lightweight. I own the counterpart in Canon and Nikon, and this thing is so small. It's a 67mm filter. It's an easy lens to carry around in the bag all the time, even if you never use it. You should never go anywhere on any assignment without a wide-angle lens because you never know when you need it. And the fact that it's got the linear motor in it, just like the big G Master glass does, is phenomenal. So I really, really like shooting this lens a lot. Here's a portrait of somebody COVID living, basically a homeless person, and kind of a sad story, but her eyes are tack sharp, and the window behind her is out of focus because I'm at 1.4, even though it's wide angle. I shoot a lot of basketball with super wides on remotes. This is a floor remote looking up at the hoop, and the 24 G Master is a great lens for this. This is a COVID portrait of a high school senior that didn't get to graduate, and so we shot the picture in her empty parking lot at her high school, and it really kind of tells the story. I also like that the G Master doesn't bend people up too much. Here's a great example of that. You wouldn't think about getting this close to someone with a 24mm lens in a portrait, but it really works, and I really like it. There's a little bit of distortion, but I think it's easily acceptable. And look at the background. I mean, to be able to get this close and then show the entire environment is really cool. Then comes the 600 f4. I love this lens. Oh, this lens and I have a relationship. I much prefer the 6 over the 4. And it just gives me the best combination of autofocus speed, sharpness, but most important, the backgrounds are completely blown out. Even when I'm really, really far away from the subject. Like if I'm way downfield, it still blows the backgrounds out behind my subjects. I find adding the 1.4x to the 600 gives me a great reach to see into the action on the other side of the field that people don't even see and know is there because they're just too loose, especially in American football. Adding the A1 to the back of a 600 GM brings about a new experience in terms of a radical acquire and tracking. A1 plus the 600 GM is unstoppable, and if you do the punch in by using the ring on the focus ring, 600 millimeters times 1.5 is 900 millimeter f4, and you still have a 21 megapixel file that you can crop from there if you need it. I wanted to talk briefly about the FD linear motors and the floating focus mechanism, because it's just incredible. It gives you, this is the 51.2, the new lens. It just gives you this amazing ability to be flawless. And being flawless is awesome, and being flawless at 30 frames per second is insane. And so all the lenses that I've chosen are all basically able to do this because of the motors and because of the Alpha 1. So for me, my favorite lenses are always going to be, they're always going to have linear motors in them, and they're always going to be, used with the Alpha 1 for this purpose. Just look at this. This is a giveaway video from Sony, but it still shows how unbelievably perfect the autofocus is, even at 1.2. Breathtaking. So the XD linear motors, they offer this ultra-fast depth of field focusing, which is hard for lenses to do, and then real-time tracking, and then totally quiet autofocus. It's the answer for a lot of problems.